3 miles down in the Philippine Sea, a ghostly silhouette emerges from the eternal darkness. The USS St. sits perfectly upright on the ocean floor, as if she just arrived yesterday. But this isn't some peaceful retirement. A massive crater tears through her flight deck like a wound that refuses to heal. For 75 years, she's been waiting in the abyss, holding the story of the most pivotal moment in naval warfare history, the first major warship ever sunk by a kamikaze attack. And now, finally, we can see exactly how it happened. On May 14, 2019, the research vessel RV Petrel was methodically scanning the depths of the Philippine Sea when their autonomous underwater vehicle detected something massive on the sonar. Sitting at a crushing depth of 4,736 meters lay the shadow of what appeared to be an intact warship. The Discovery team knew they were looking at something extraordinary before they even sent down the camera. At nearly 3 miles below the surface, on the very edge of the Philippine Trench, nothing should survive in such pristine condition. The pressure down there is over 470 times greater than at sea level, about 474 atmospheres, capable of crushing a human body in milliseconds. But when the remotely operated vehicle's lights first illuminated the wreck on May 25th, what they saw defied every expectation about deep-sea preservation. The USS St. sat bolt upright, bow pointing north, as if she'd been gently lowered into position by some giant hand. Her flight deck stretched out in perfect symmetry, interrupted only by that one horrific crater that punched straight through to the hangar bay below. The ship's island superstructure rose from the deck like a metal monument, its radar arrays and communication equipment still clearly visible, despite 7.5 decades underwater. Anti-aircraft gun mounts remained in position throughout the ship. Even the aircraft elevators, those massive platforms that lifted fighter planes from the hangar to the flight deck, were frozen in their final position. What struck the survey team immediately was the remarkable completeness of it all. The St. condition was extraordinary for a ship destroyed in violent combat. The cold, oxygen-starved environment at this depth acts like nature's own preservation chamber. Temperatures hover just above freezing year-round, and the lack of dissolved oxygen means the normal processes of decay and corrosion slow to a crawl. Initial identification came quickly once the ROV captured clear images of the hull number painted on her bow, CVE-63. Cross-referencing with naval records confirmed this was indeed the USS St. Originally commissioned as the USS Midway, before being renamed on October 10, 1944, to honor the U.S. Army's victory at Saint-Lô in France. She was a Casablanca-class escort carrier, one of 50 such ships built by Kaiser shipyards during the war's most desperate period. These weren't frontline warships built for heavy combat. Escort carriers like the St. were converted merchant vessels designed to ferry aircraft to combat zones and provide air support for invasion forces. They were thinly armored, lightly armed, and never intended to face enemy battleships. But that's exactly what the St. had done on her final day. The Discovery announcement, made public on October 10, 2019, exactly 75 years after the ship's renaming, sent shockwaves through naval history communities and veterans organizations. Here was not just any warship, but the vessel that represented a dark turning point in Pacific warfare, the first major ship deliberately sunk by a Japanese suicide attack. For families of the 143 men who died with the St. the Discovery brought mixed emotions. Some found closure in finally knowing where their fathers and grandfathers had come to rest. Others struggled with the surreal images of their loved ones' final resting place, a metal tomb sitting in darkness, deeper than most mountains are tall. The wreck's exceptional preservation made it immediately clear that this would be one of the most valuable World War II archaeological sites ever discovered. Every detail of a 1944 escort carrier was frozen in time, from the flight deck layout to the placement of individual weapons system. It was like looking through a window into October 25, 1944. But what made the discovery truly significant wasn't just the ship's condition. It was what the wreck could finally confirm about one of the most important tactical developments of the Pacific War. For the first time, researchers could see exactly what a kamikaze attack did to a major warship, documenting the effectiveness of the tactic that would define the war's final year. To understand what the wreck was showing them, the survey team had to piece together the St. Armul's final day, October 25, 1944, during what would become known as the Battle off Samar, the most lopsided naval engagement in modern history. The St. Lo was part of Task Unit 77.4.3, nicknamed Taffy-3, a small group of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, providing air support for the landings at Leyte in the Philippines. Under the command of Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, this was not a force designed for major fleet action. But at dawn on October 25th, that's exactly what they faced. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, including the massive battleship Yamato and 3 other battleships, emerged from San Bernardino Strait and caught Taffy-3 completely by surprise. Kurita's ships displaced more tonnage than entire Allied fleets, and their guns could sink any ship in Taffy-3 with a single salvo. What followed was naval combat at its most desperate and heroic. The St. Lo, commanded by Captain Francis McKenna, found herself facing the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled. The logical response would have been to run, and indeed, Admiral Sprague ordered his ships to flee toward a rain squall that might provide cover. But running wasn't enough. The Japanese ships were faster, and their guns had longer range, so Sprague made a decision that military historians still study today. He ordered his destroyers to charge the enemy battle line in a suicidal torpedo attack, while his carriers launched every available aircraft to harass the advancing Japanese fleet. The St. Lo's crew worked with desperate efficiency to get their planes airborne. Her flight deck became a scene of controlled chaos as TBM Avenger torpedo bombers and FM-2 Wildcat fighters launched with whatever ordnance was available, some with torpedoes, others with depth charges, some with nothing but machine gun ammunition. Pilots who'd never attacked surface ships dove on battleships and cruisers, making strafing runs that couldn't possibly penetrate heavy armor, but might distract enemy gunners. The St. Lo's single 5-inch gun fired continuously at any Japanese target within range. Whether these shots caused significant damage to armored warships is debatable, but the gunners claimed hits on enemy cruisers. Every shot was an act of defiance against impossible odds. For over 2 hours, the escort carriers maneuvered frantically to avoid shell splashes that rose like water mountains around their hulls. By some miracle, the desperate American defense worked. Confused by the ferocity of the counterattack and concerned about American reinforcements, Admiral Kurita ordered his fleet to withdraw around 9:20 a.m., just as victory seemed within his grasp. The escort carriers had survived the impossible, but their relief was premature. At approximately 10:51 a.m., as the crew was recovering from their morning battle, lookouts spotted aircraft approaching from the east. These weren't the massive formations they'd been fighting all morning, just a handful of planes flying low and fast toward the carrier formation. What the lookouts were seeing was something entirely new in naval warfare, the first organized kamikaze attack in history. Lieutenant Yukio Seki of the newly formed Shimpu Special Attack Unit had led 5 bomb-laden Zero fighters on a one-way mission to destroy American aircraft carriers. The age of suicide attacks had begun, and the USS St. Lo was about to become its first major victim. One of the Zeros, possibly piloted by Seki himself, though historical records aren't definitive about which pilot targeted which ship, came in at a steep angle, aiming for the most vulnerable part of any aircraft carrier, the flight deck directly above the hangar bay, where fuel lines and ammunition storage created a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Anti-aircraft gunners on the St. Lo opened fire, but the approaching aircraft was moving too fast and too low for effective defensive fire. The Zero struck the flight deck with tremendous force, its engine and fuel tank acting like a massive armor-piercing projectile that punched through the wooden deck planking and steel framework. Survivor accounts described the impact as unlike anything they'd experienced in 2 years of combat. The aircraft crashed into the hangar bay below, where maintenance crews were working on parked aircraft, and aviation fuel was stored in quantity. What happened next transformed the Kamikaze from a desperate gesture into a ship killer. The Zero's impact and subsequent explosion ignited aviation fuel stored in the hangar, creating an instant inferno that spread faster than damage control teams could respond. Within minutes, the expanding fire reached the ship's torpedo and bomb storage areas, where hundreds of tons of ordnance waited to be loaded onto aircraft for future mission. The first secondary explosion came quickly, as stored torpedoes detonated in a blast that witnesses described as lifting the entire ship out of the water. This was followed by a series of smaller explosions as bombs and ammunition cooked off in the spreading fire. Each blast weakened the ship's structure and spread the flames further through the vessel. Captain McKenna ordered abandoned ship within 15 minutes of the initial impact, recognizing that his vessel was doomed. The St. Lo's crew had drilled for damage control scenario, but nothing had prepared them for this kind of catastrophic destruction. Within 30 minutes of the Kamikaze strike, the escort carrier slipped beneath the wave. Of the 889 crew members aboard, 113 were killed or went missing during the sinking itself. Another 30 men died later from burns and blast injuries, bringing the total death toll to 143. Destroyers USS Dennis and USS Raymond pulled 746 survivors from the oil-slicked water, many suffering from severe trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The rescued men described their ship's final moments with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. They'd survived the most powerful surface fleet in Japanese naval history, only to be sunk by a single damaged fighter plane carrying a bomb. It was their introduction to a new kind of warfare that would dominate the Pacific's final year. The high-resolution footage from 15,000 feet down revealed details that perfectly matched the survivor accounts of October 25, 1944. What the cameras found confirmed the devastating effectiveness of that first organized kamikaze attack and showed exactly how the new tactic had worked. The kamikaze crater itself was clearly visible, a roughly circular hole approximately 30 feet in diameter, with edges that showed the characteristic deformation of steel penetrated by high-velocity impact. The crater's depth and the surrounding blast pattern confirmed that the Zero had indeed punched through the flight deck and exploded in the hangar bay below, exactly as survivors had described. Radiating outward from this impact site, the wreck showed the secondary damage caused by the cascading series of internal explosions. Areas of deck plating had been peeled back and twisted by explosive forces from below, exactly what you'd expect if stored ordnance had detonated throughout different parts of the ship. This damage pattern perfectly supported survivor accounts of the rapid fire spread and multiple secondary explosions. The survey revealed blown-out hull sections that documented the violence of the ship's final moments. These weren't clean breaks, but jagged tears in the steel plating that spoke to the tremendous forces unleashed when hundreds of tons of aviation ordnance detonated simultaneously. The damage was consistent with reports of explosions so powerful they lifted the entire ship out of the water. Around the main wreck, scattered across the seafloor, survey teams identified debris that told the story of the St. Lo's final minutes. Pieces of American aircraft were clearly visible, parts from FM-2 Wildcat fighters and TBM Avenger torpedo bombers that had been caught in the hangar during the attack. When the explosions ripped through the ship, these aircraft were destroyed instantly, their wreckage blown clear during the vessel's death throes. One particularly telling piece of evidence was a section of aircraft wing that showed both impact damage and extensive fire scarring. The metal's deformation indicated it had been subjected to the initial kamikaze blast and then to the secondary explosions as fire spread through the hangar. This finding perfectly supported survivor accounts of how quickly the destruction had spread through the ship. The ship's superstructure provided additional confirmation of the crew's final moment. Communication equipment remained in position, suggesting that Captain McKenna and his officers had been able to coordinate the abandoned ship order effectively. The bridge showed no signs of direct damage, indicating that command and control had been maintained until the very end. Anti-aircraft gun mounts were visible throughout the ship, frozen in their final position. These weapons had been the St. Lo's only defense against the kamikaze attack, but they told the story of how quickly the suicide plane had closed the distance. There simply hadn't been time for effective defensive fire against an aircraft that was already committed to crashing into the ship. The wreck's preservation allowed surveyors to document details of 1940s naval aviation that exist nowhere else. The flight deck layout, hangar configuration, and weapons placement were all exactly as they appeared in 1944, providing an unmatched record of World War II escort carrier design and operation. Perhaps most significantly, the wreck confirmed that the first organized kamikaze attack had worked exactly as its planners intended. The Zero had struck the most vulnerable part of the ship and triggered the kind of catastrophic secondary explosions that would make suicide attacks the most feared tactic of the Pacific War's final year. The survey also revealed the human cost of this tactical innovation. While no personal effects were visible in the external survey, which was limited to the wreck's exterior out of respect for the war grave, the ship itself had become a monument to the 143 men who died with her. Every twisted piece of steel and every blast-scarred surface represented lives lost to a new and terrible form of warfare. The debris field around the St. Lo extended roughly 200 meters in all directions. documenting not just the violence of her destruction, but also the completeness of it. This wasn't a ship that had been damaged and slowly sunk. It was a vessel that had been systematically destroyed from within by her own ordnance, triggered by a single well-placed enemy attack. The wreck of the USS St. serves as more than just a war grave or historical artifact. It's a three-dimensional document that confirms one of the most significant tactical developments in naval warfare. The discovery has provided unprecedented insight into the effectiveness of kamikaze attacks and their impact on Allied naval strategy during the Pacific War's final phase. Under the Sunken Military Craft Act of 2004, the St. is legally protected as both a sovereign vessel of the United States Navy and a war grave containing the remains of military personnel. This designation prohibits unauthorized disturbance, salvage, or removal of artifacts without explicit permission from the Navy. The site exists in international waters, but U.S. jurisdiction extends to any vessel flying the American flag at the time of sinking, regardless of location. The practical implications of this protection are significant. The 2019 survey was conducted entirely externally, with no penetration of the ship's interior out of respect for the dead and legal requirements. Future research must balance scientific value against reverence for the 143 men who remain with their ship and the concerns of their family. For the families of those who died with the St. the wreck's discovery brought a complex mixture of closure and renewed grief. Some relatives expressed gratitude for finally knowing where their loved ones had come to rest. Others found the images of the ship's final resting place deeply moving, particularly seeing how well the deep ocean had preserved their father's and grandfather's final workplace. Discovery has also provided crucial historical confirmation of how kamikaze tactics evolved and why they became so effective. The St. destruction demonstrated that a single aircraft, properly aimed and carrying sufficient explosives, could destroy even a large warship by triggering secondary explosion. This understanding helps explain why the U.S. Navy quickly developed new defensive measures and modified carrier operations to minimize vulnerability to suicide attack. The technical aspects of the discovery represent a milestone in deep-sea archaeology. The survey techniques used by RV Petrel demonstrated that detailed investigation of wrecks at extreme depths is now feasible, opening possibilities for exploring other deep-water sites that have been inaccessible until recently. The St. exceptional preservation has made it one of the most complete World War II ship records ever documented. Environmental considerations add important context to the site's long-term preservation. The wreck sits at a depth where climate change effects are minimal, and the surrounding ecosystem has adapted to the ship's presence over 7 decades. Marine life now uses the St. as an artificial reef, creating a unique deep-sea habitat that has evolved around the memorial. The discovery timing, announced on October 10, 2019, exactly 75 years after the ship's renaming, provided a powerful connection between past and present. Veterans organizations and naval historians mark the moment as an opportunity to remember not just the St. crew, but all the sailors who faced the terrifying innovation of organized suicide attacks during the war's final year. The wreck has also highlighted the broader story of escort carriers and their crews during World War II. These vessels and their sailors often receive less attention than fleet carriers or battleships, but ships like the St. were essential to Allied victory in the Pacific. They provided air cover for amphibious landing, hunted submarine, and, as demonstrated at Samar, could fight desperately and effectively even against overwhelming odds. The battle off Samar itself has gained renewed attention following the St. discovery. The morning surface action, where Taffy 3's tiny force faced down the most powerful Japanese fleet of the war, is now recognized as one of the most remarkable David and Goliath encounters in naval history. The fact that these same ships then became victims of the first organized kamikaze attack adds layers of tragedy and historical significance to their story. Looking forward, the St. protected status should ensure her preservation for future generations, but threats exist. Deep-sea mining operations are expanding into previously untouched ocean areas, and while the wreck's protected status should shield it from direct mining activity, nearby operations could affect the environmental conditions that have preserved the ship so remarkably well. The human dimension of the story remains perhaps the most important. The St. represents 143 individual tragedies, men who died far from home in a new and terrifying form of warfare. But it also represents the courage of those who served aboard escort carriers, knowing they were sailing in thin-skinned ships that could be sunk by a single well-placed enemy attack. The wreck confirms that the first organized kamikaze attack succeeded beyond its planners' expectation, providing Japanese commanders with a new weapon that would claim dozens more Allied ships before the war's end. Understanding how that success was achieved and documenting the precise nature of the damage it caused helps historians and military analysts better understand this dark chapter in warfare's evolution. 3 miles down in the Philippine Sea, the USS St. sits in perfect preservation, bearing witness to the moment when naval warfare changed forever. Her flight deck crater tells the story of October 25, 1944, when desperate innovation met overwhelming courage, and when a new chapter in the Pacific War was written in fire and steel. The wreck has answered the fundamental question about kamikaze effectiveness that historians have debated for decades. Looking at the blast patterns, the secondary damage, and the debris field, there's no mystery about what happened to the St. Lo. A single aircraft deliberately crashed into her most vulnerable spot, triggered the cascading explosions that destroyed her within 30 minutes. But the St. Lo's story extends far beyond the mechanics of her destruction. She represents the moment when warfare became something different, when traditional concepts of honor and tactics gave way to desperate measures that would define the Pacific War's final year. Every ship that followed would sail knowing what a determined enemy pilot could accomplish with one well-aimed suicide attack. The 143 men who died with the St. Lo couldn't have known they were witnessing the birth of a new form of warfare. They thought they were fighting a conventional naval battle, having just survived an impossible morning engagement against the most powerful fleet Japan could field. Instead, they became the first victims of organized kamikaze tactics, their sacrifice marking the beginning of warfare's darkest innovation. Today, their ship serves as both memorial and historical document, preserved by the deep ocean's embrace and protected by law as a war grave. She's a monument to courage in the face of impossible odds, and a reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, ordinary people can rise to extraordinary heights. The USS St. Lo found her final resting place in the abyss, but her story continues to teach us about sacrifice, innovation, and the terrible cost of war.